Hello, thank you for watching our presentation, Classifying Reuse and Assessing It with Care. My name is Ayla Stein Kenfield, and I'm the Repository Services Librarian at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and my co-presenter is Santi Thompson, Head of Digital Research Services at the University of Houston Libraries. In this presentation, we'll give you a brief introduction to the project, describe the use-reuse matrix and its purpose, introduce guidelines we've been drafting for ethical reuse assessment, and conclude with how it all ties together, our next steps, including how you can provide feedback. The Content Reuse Working Group, just one of the groups under the DLF Assessment Interest Group, focuses on developing standards, strategies, and workflows for assessing the use and reuse of digital objects across Glamour institutions. The Content Reuse Working Group is developing the Digital Content Reuse Assessment Toolkit, or DCRAFT. This project is generously funded by a National Leadership Grant for Libraries Award from the Institute of Museum and Library Services and started in July 2019. Working group members are building the toolkit in two phases. The first phase includes work on ethical guidelines and recommended practices. Phase 2 will see the development of assessment training to help practitioners integrate the toolkit into their local workflows. Broadly, the goal of DCRAFT is to enable assessment of how digital objects in Glamour collections are being reused and to do so in an ethical way. There are a lot of challenges in this work. One of the biggest ones is the current lack of standards and common practices for assessing reuse, or even what reuse is and how it's different from use. The DCRAFT project approaches this gap from various angles. Defining use, reuse, and ethically assessing it will be two particular aspects we will explore in this presentation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Santi to talk about the model we created to define use and reuse.
Thanks, Ayla. Up next is classifying use and reuse, the use-reuse matrix. The project team inherited a nuanced understanding of use and reuse from a previously IMLS-funded grant project titled Developing a Framework for Measuring Reuse of Digital Objects, or Measuring Reuse for short. In this project, the team defined use as the initial access of an item. Nothing is known about how the item is utilized after it's initially accessed. Reuse, on the other hand, is how the item is utilized after the initial access has occurred. Measuring Reuse focus group participants teased out the differences and critiqued the initial definitions of the Measuring Reuse project. Over the course of the discussions, a common sentiment expressed was that reuse metrics should provide contextual information that help Glamour institutions determine who their users are, where digital objects are being reused, what users do with digital objects, and most importantly, why those digital objects are meaningful to users. However, the consensus of reuse as an indicator of impact did not lead to a more robust understanding of how to define reuse. It became clear that the definition would need to be expansive, with metrics defined broadly enough to reflect how value is considered differently by institutions and communities. Where there was no clear consensus on the difference between use and reuse, two ways of viewing reuse emerged. First, reuse as any action outside the initial repository or exposure point. And second, reuse as a transformative act, either involving the object directly or its surroundings. Because of these varying approaches to defining reuse, the project team determined that use and reuse exist on a spectrum and should not be considered discrete binary choices. The spectrum depicts a series of activities arranged by level of engagement. The use end of the spectrum begins with access, which are activities that involve the least amount of interaction to perform, such as opening the full text of an article. At the other end of the spectrum is transformation, which involves the highest degree of interaction with a digital object. While modeling use and reuse on a spectrum was a step in the right direction, it did not capture the complexities involved because it did not adequately highlight how middle tier levels such as enhancement, sharing, and recontextualization, could encompass actions that are sometimes use and other times reuse. The team realized that this spectrum was part of a more complex matrix, which could account for specific actions that fall into a definition of both use or reuse along the spectrum. Examples of users accessing or consuming digital objects, which the team defines as use because of the passive interaction that indicates a potential value, are listed towards a more simple level of engagement, as shown in the selected portion of the matrix here. Recontextualization, on the other hand, represents a more complex level of engagement. Most of the examples of recontextualization fall into the reuse definition because they are indicative of active interactions that demonstrate value to a user. We'll be happy to answer more questions about the matrix in Slack after the presentation. For now, I'm going to pass it over to Ayla, who will discuss the ethical guidelines.
Thanks, Santi. Now I'm going to talk about the ethical guidelines we're developing as part of the toolkit. Ethical guidelines. What are they? They're a set of principles that we believe are necessary to consider when planning to assess reuse of digital materials. Why should we create these ethical guidelines? The idea for them originally sprouted from one of the prioritized use cases we developed from the results of our Measuring Reuse project. Additionally, we in the project team felt it was important to remind practitioners, including ourselves, that assessment data doesn't exist in a vacuum. How are the guidelines developed? The project team divvied ourselves up into subgroups to tackle each of the grant activities. The ethical guidelines group reviewed codes of ethics from prominent organizations in the glamour sphere, like ALA, the Society of American Archivists, the American Alliance of Museums, ASIST, etc. And work such as ethics in research use of library patron data by our colleagues in the Privacy and Ethics in Technology Working Group to get a sense of what topics should be addressed and where existing documents, especially in the official codes of ethics, were lacking. How do I use these ethical guidelines? So the document lays out the scope and goals of the guidelines, a list of the defined terms, and the core values, which are really the heart of the document. So there are 6 core values: inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility, and social justice, or ideas, because we need another acronym, privacy, traditional knowledge, cultural heritage, and intellectual property, professional development and training, transparency, and impartiality. The guidelines describe what each of these values mean, why they're important to reuse assessment, and practical applications and considerations. I want to take a minute to note that there's an asterisk on impartiality because I promise you, it is not what you think when librarians, archivists, and curators typically say they value concepts like impartiality or neutrality. Unfortunately, I do not have time to go into further depth about the core values here. Please note that we are not claiming nor trying to be arbiters of morality or ethics. We're trying to figure out practical ways of applying principles of care, social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion to assessing reuse of digital objects. This is messy, confusing work in the best of times. Thinking about this in 2020 oscillates between feeling timely and appropriate, are trivial and inconsequential, sometimes all of those things at once. So we're going to mess up. We may not be on the right path. Please tell us how you think we can improve on this work to be useful, so it's useful to you and your communities. That being said, the ethical guidelines are open for comment, and we would very much appreciate your feedback. The link to the document will be posted in the DLF Forum Slack and on Twitter using both the DLF Forum and the Dig Reuse hashtags. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Santi.
And now I'm going to conclude the presentation. So the use-reuse matrix and the ethical guidelines are foundational activities for the DCRAP project. The team believes that these early efforts are essential building blocks for crafting a reuse assessment framework and toolkit. These contributions, in conjunction with other DCRAF content to come, like the recommended practices and assessment training, are all needed to conduct a thorough, holistic reuse assessment. While the team strives to develop a toolkit that reinforces traditional, measurable, well-defined metrics, we are also committed to centering the toolkit around care, social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And we'll be happy to answer any of your questions in Slack. Thanks so much.